Cleaning toms. Several methods here. I used to do it the manual way. If you guys don't mind, I like to go to 1 or 2 or 3 methods because I think people tend to focus too much on a certain plugin, and then that's the way to go. And I think there are so many other ways to do it, and you might end up in a situation where you don't have the plugin or you don't have the processing power or whatever. The idea usually what you do with toms, or what most people do for metal anyway, is to clean everything that is not a tom head. Like you want to go in, let's just use the tom 4 in this case, do a bit of a small fade in, and now we've got our tom 4 kind of clean. We can decide how long we want the tail. Obviously, there's a cymbal hidden. So what I do now is go in, mark the bits until the end. Audio suite. Use any EQ now. Just use a low pass filter. Add around 400 hertz. Process. So what we have now is we're taking out all the high end out of the tail. Do a bit of a crossfade. Do a fade out. And now we've got a cleaned out tom sound that still has the sustain going on, but not the cymbal.
The TLA method.
That's the old school method. And now with all the cool plugins, we don't have to do that anymore. So another plugin I used a lot for this is this guy. So because the idea is to gate the high end, but not the low end. So I've got my little preset for that. And that's a gate that has 2 different release times for different frequency ranges. So I've got the split here at around 400 in this case. This one's got a longer release, like 700, and the high end has got like an immediate release and barely any hold. And I can use a key there, key tom 4. Let's just solo this. And it's doing the same thing. Like if I just solo low end, that keeps going, and the high end goes away immediately. So it's essentially what we just did. The only thing to look out for with this plugin is we still have the same key. And sometimes now it doesn't accept the key input. And it took me a while to figure out why that is, because I had the key sent to the plugin, but it wouldn't accept it. The gate wouldn't work. And the reason that happened is because apparently the gate in Neutron needs some sound at least. And my key tracks here have no sound at all. So that's why I've got the old SSL channel with the analog on, like this stupid hiss that everyone's turning off. That's the only reason why I've got the SSL channel on here. So I've got some noise, and the gate recognizes the noise, and the key works properly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very
but
clever.
Now it's much easier, isn't it, with Silencer? It's such a good plugin. I just didn't want to start with that right away because everyone's doing it now, and I like to show people options. I think this was the first session I used Silencer on. For you guys who don't know it, it's doing exactly the same thing, just with less control. So you can adjust the amount of bleed you have and the length. It's doing the same thing. So I can turn the bleed all the way down, or more bleed. Okay, there's actually not much bleed going on anyway. Yeah. So usually the standard settings it opens up with are pretty good. So this is triggering from the tone tracks now. But there might be soft hits, so I like to use the key here as well. There we go. Again, same thing. It just keeps the low end a bit longer than the high end. Usually you're fine just copying that over to the other tracks. And then sometimes I'll adjust the length for the longer.
I think it's worth mentioning for everyone watching, if it's not clear what's happening. If you think about a tom, right? You have a smack to the tom where you have like a really bright transient, and then you have the body, and the body rings out, but the frequency range of the body is low, whatever the fundamental of the tom is, and maybe a few harmonics. So when you have a cymbal that follows afterwards, there's no reason to have any high end in the top, the top end above what the body needs to resonate out, because it's just, it's only on the transient. So what's happening is basically you're letting the transient go through so you can, for example, EQ it and make the tom attack really bright, but then getting rid of everything above the high frequency range and then letting the body of the tom ring out. So the now real tom sound, even though there's bleed, sounds like a sample.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. I assumed that everyone saw people use the silence already, but yeah, that's exactly the reasoning behind that. And it works great. So yeah, now I'll go in and depending on the speed of the song often, or the amount of tom hits he's playing, or how fast he's playing, I just adjust the tail for the individual toms, and it's going to be a bit longer for the floor toms and a bit shorter for the Bleed this guy a bit more. So I've got a bit of a cymbal coming up here, so I could, for this one, because you see the cymbal is right after that. Could gate it quicker. But I don't like that, I want the sustain in there. Could decrease the bleed. That's good enough for me. If you go too far, you might lose some of the transient. Don't forget, you've got overheads playing, you've got room mics playing, so you got bleed anyway. So some bleed from these tracks is not going to kill your mix. And if it is, you're going to hear it. Like there might be a fill later where you hear it like come up all of a sudden. In that case, there's nothing wrong with just cutting out a clean sample from somewhere else and pasting it there. I do that all the time. But for now, this should be good enough for the toms. So I don't need to get rid of all the snare, but I still want some more control in my drum tracks. So I want to get rid of some of the snare. And there are several ways of doing that. I can't remember exactly what I did in this mix, but I want to show you 1, 2, maybe 3 different ways anyway, just to give you more tools for your toolbox, because it's not necessarily about what I did in this mix, but how I approach things. And I want to give you some, like I said, some tools. One thing that is working very well is a plugin called Big Beautiful Door. And I've got my starting point here. Call it snare removal. Everyone's using a sidechain key triggered compressor all the time. And this is the same, but as an EQ. So here, the sidechain, the key input, triggers an EQ. And in this case, I set it to be a low-cut filter. So whenever the snare hits now, because I fed the key track into the sidechain of this plugin, whenever the snare hits, there's the low-pass filter that gets switched on. So let me see if we can actually hear this. Let's listen to the sidechain first. That's the sidechain signal. So now, it's magic, isn't it? Let's bypass this. And on. So for the briefest amount of time, there's a low cut filter being automated into the signal only when the snare hits. And since the cymbals only lose the low end for a tiny amount of time, and it's not really that important to the cymbal sound, it doesn't really alter the sound of the cymbals too much. So you can get away with a good amount of snare removal from your overheads like this. So that's a great trick. But always bear in mind, you're working with a low cut filter again. And whenever you work with a filter at the point of the crossover frequency, you can run into phase issues. Here, I'm not too worried because I'm at like 765. Might be the hi-hat changing the sound a little bit, but I didn't hear anything negative. So I could just use this, but I don't. What I do is use something else. Let's use this guy, Drum Leveler. Again, we've got 2 versions. We've got the Sound Radix one, and then there's a newer one, conveniently called Drum Leveler with an M, which is the Melter version. Like very much the same as with the auto line we talked about earlier. There's auto line and there's M auto line and there's Drum Leveler and there's M Drum Leveler.
Melter makes great plugins. I feel like they're not kind of like a slept on company. They don't get as much hype as some of the other stuff, but they really make great stuff. And
this is fantastic because, like, for the guys who know Drum Leveler, this is not what I'm using it for now, but it levels out your drum tracks, the volume. And with the original Drum Leveler, you've got one like target level thing that you can adjust. With a Melter version, you've got, besides all the other extras, you've got MIDI and like a load of extras, but you've got several different target velocities. So you could have like your loud velocity, a medium velocity, and like a blast beat velocity, for example. So you set your thresholds accordingly, and then like the blast beats all get moved more towards this one, and the loud hits more towards this one. I created some presets that I use for what I'm about to do now, which is not leveling, but kind of like, I want to say, selective ducking. So what I do here is, like you see, I've got 4 billion presets that all say the same thing. And it's all basically the same settings. So I might just as well do it from scratch. So what we do, we listen to the sidechain here, which in this case is not my key input. I'm going to tell you why in a second, but I'm just using the EQ here. I'm trying to find the frequency for the snare fundamental. I don't have too much bleed from kick, not a problem in this case, or other elements in the overhead track. So this now is my sidechain input. And I can tell the plugin, where's my target level? So and I can set this target level, and I can set the amount of compression. So if I set it to 100%, whenever a signal exceeds the threshold, it'll bring up the volume to exactly this level. What I can do in this case, I don't want to bring the snare up, but I want to bring it down. So my target level is somewhere down here now. So now I set the threshold so that it grabs at least the loud snare hits. Okay, this is totally overdone now, but you'll hear that whenever the snare hits, it gets ducked from the overheads. Obviously, it's pumping like crazy, and it doesn't sound great, but I never go 100%. So if you go just, 15, 20%. You won't actually hear it affect the cymbals. So let me just take this in and out now with a bypass and listen to the snare, how it doesn't disappear, but it gets softer. And this is a great tool to get some of the snare out of the overheads. And whenever I want a very direct sound, I want to use a lot of the direct mics and samples, I'm doing one of these 2 or 3 things. Could just use a limiter and duck the loud snare hits, but I think this is a bit more selective and gives me a bit more possibilities to tweak stuff and fine-tune stuff. Usually I set the threshold so that the very soft hits, which don't really happen here, like blast beats and stuff, don't get ducked, but the loud hits do. So let's go to a section with loud hits. Okay, let's compare it again, off and on. I think it's clear that the snare is kind of quite a bit softer now. So let's do this now with the snare active as well, like the direct mics, so you can hear the difference. It's going to be a bit more punchy, a bit more direct sounding. So just to give me a little bit more control.